There is a familiar pattern that has come to define Theresa May's premiership. Encouraging rhetoric gets periodically wheeled out, the pledges to ease the burden on the just about managing, the promises to fight the burning injustices of social inequality. But then a few weeks later, the chancellor gets up at the dispatch box to deliver a budget, or an autumn statement, and it's as if those words had never been uttered. So tomorrow's budget is the first real opportunity to test whether May really meant what she said when she promised that the decade of austerity is over in her Conservative Party conference speech earlier this month. If it meant anything at all, we should be expecting a radical U-turn from her chancellor, Philip Hammond. In the last few years, as the cuts have really started to bite, austerity has morphed from theoretical Whitehall discussions about how best to salami-slice departmental budgets into the reality of people's everyday lives. It's what lies behind the fraying threads of our social fabric, the older and disabled people who no longer get the support they need with basic tasks such as washing, dressing and eating. The schools contemplating reducing their opening hours because they can no longer afford to teach the normal school week. The libraries, youth centers and children's centers that have permanently closed their doors. The cancelled operations that have left people in unnecessary pain for weeks or even months. And the low-income families struggling to make ends meet as a result of the billions that have been hived off the benefits bill. But there is perhaps no more visible manifestation of austerity than the disgraceful levels of homelessness we see in Britain today. Tents and mattresses lining the streets of towns and cities across the country, home to people forced to sleep rough, have become an increasingly common sight. The number of people estimated to be sleeping rough on any given night has risen by 169% since 2010. Beyond this, there are tens of thousands of homeless families housed in temporary accommodation, often in B. If Britain left the EU without unfettered access to its single market, the worst of austerity could be yet to come. As our special report explores, rising levels of homelessness are a product of a multifaceted austerity. They are the result of long-term underinvestment in social housing. The stock of homes available for social rent has dropped from 7 meters in the 1980s to under 5 meters today. Deep welfare cuts and rising rents have resulted in a growing gap in many areas of the country between what help people on low incomes receive to cover their housing and what that housing actually costs in the private rental sector. Delays with universal credit have compounded the problem, pushing people into rent arrears and putting them at risk of losing their homes. And the retrenchment of services such as mental health and drug rehabilitation means that vulnerable people are more likely to find themselves on the street. According to George Osborne and Philip Hammond, the cuts were a necessary burden the country had to bear in the wake of the financial crash. But they were in fact a deliberate political choice. Rather than slashing services, Tory chancellors could have chosen not to cut taxes. Instead, they will have delivered £22 billion of income tax cuts a year by 2021, with most of the benefits flowing to the most affluent half of families, and £13 billion of corporation tax cuts a year, leaving Britain with one of the lowest corporation tax rates of the advanced economies. Meanwhile, billions of pounds of cuts to benefits and tax credits mean that many disabled people and families with children stand to lose huge sums. The poorest fifth of families with children will be on average £3,000 worse off a year as a result of tax and benefit changes since 2010. The budget will also be a reminder of the dark, Brexit-shaped cloud of uncertainty that hangs over the economy. The amount of government revenue Hammond has to play with depends entirely on the Office for Budget Responsibility's assumptions about how Britain will leave the EU next March. Hammond should really be presenting 3 budgets, based on the assumption we stay in the EU, the assumption we manage to negotiate a Canada-style free trade deal that is somehow consistent with resolving the Irish border issue, and the assumption we leave without a deal. That would make clear the trade-offs involved. The truth is that if Britain left the EU without unfettered access to its single market, the worst of austerity could be yet to come. Tomorrow will only signal the end of austerity if Hammond takes decisive action to halt, and even to reverse, the spending cuts and to restore benefit levels to what they were a decade ago. But the real end of austerity test will never be met by a figure pulled out of Hammond's red box. It will only be met when we start to see libraries and youth centers reopening their doors, when there are fewer operations cancelled and more older people able to access the care services they need, and when there are fewer people forced to sleep rough on Britain's streets.